Most people misunderstand what an empath truly notices. They think empathy is softness. They think it is emotional kindness without awareness. But what they fail to understand is that an empath is constantly observing things other people ignore. While most individuals focus only on spoken words, the empath watches behavior, tone, hesitation, emotional shifts, breathing patterns, facial tension, and silence. They are paying attention to the emotional structure underneath communication, not just the language itself. And this is exactly why deception becomes so difficult around them. A lie is never only verbal. Every lie creates emotional imbalance somewhere inside the body. Human beings can rehearse sentences, but controlling emotional leakage is much harder. The eyes tighten differently. The voice changes rhythm. Defensiveness appears too quickly. Explanations become too detailed. And even when the words sound believable, something underneath them feels disconnected. Most people overlook these contradictions because they are distracted by surface presentation. But the empath notices patterns naturally, not because they are magical, not because they are psychic, but because pain trained them to observe carefully. Many empaths grew up in emotionally unpredictable environments, where they had to read moods in order to feel safe. They learned how to detect tension before conflict started. They learned how to recognize emotional instability before words exposed it openly. Over time, the nervous system becomes extremely sensitive to inconsistency. So when someone lies, the empath often feels the disturbance before they can logically explain it. This is what many people call intuition. But intuition is often unconscious pattern recognition happening beneath awareness. The brain notices micro-expressions, contradictions, energy shifts, and behavioral inconsistencies faster than conscious thought can organize them into language. That is why an empath will often say, "Something feels wrong," long before evidence fully appears. And the frightening thing for deceptive people is that emotionally intelligent individuals rarely become distracted by performance alone. They pay attention to alignment. Does your behavior match your words? Does your apology match your actions? Does your energy remain consistent when uncomfortable truth enters the conversation? These questions matter deeply because truth naturally creates consistency, while lies constantly require maintenance. That is why deception becomes exhausting. A lie must continuously protect itself. More explanations become necessary. More emotional performances become necessary. More manipulation becomes necessary. Eventually, the entire structure becomes unstable under the pressure of maintaining false reality. But the empath notices the cracks long before collapse happens. The tragedy, however, is not that empaths fail to detect dishonesty. The real tragedy is that many empaths ignore their own perception. They explain away discomfort because they want peace. They convince themselves they are overthinking. They give repeated chances because they genuinely believe people can change. And sometimes compassion becomes the very thing that blinds them temporarily. But maturity changes an empath completely. Eventually, they stop questioning what patterns repeatedly reveal. They realize that when words and behavior continuously conflict, behavior tells the truth. Not promises, not emotional speeches, not excuses. Patterns reveal truth over time. And once an empath learns to trust that reality, manipulation loses much of its power. Because empathy without discernment can be exploited, but empathy combined with awareness becomes incredibly powerful. The empath may remain quiet, calm, and observant, but silence does not mean blindness. Often it means they already see more than they are willing to say aloud. And eventually, every false performance collapses under the weight of contradiction, because reality always exposes what dishonesty struggles to hide forever. Truth does not require constant repair. Truth sustains itself naturally. Lies do not. Betrayal affects an empath differently than it affects most people. Because an empath does not connect casually. They invest emotionally, mentally, and spiritually into the people they care about. When trust is given, it is not partial, it is deep. That is why deception cuts them in ways many people fail to understand. The pain is never only about discovering a lie. The real pain comes from realizing they emotionally built safety around something that was not fully real. For an empath, trust is sacred because trust creates emotional security. It allows the nervous system to relax. It allows vulnerability to exist without fear. When someone says, "You can trust me," the empath does not simply hear words. They begin building emotional reality around those words. They start opening hidden parts of themselves. They start lowering defenses they normally protect carefully. And when dishonesty enters that space, the damage reaches far beyond disappointment. Because suddenly, everything becomes questioned. The empath starts replaying conversations in their mind. Were those promises genuine? Did they ever truly mean what they said? Was that affection sincere, or was it manipulation disguised as love? And once these questions begin, emotional stability starts collapsing. The mind desperately searches for clarity, because betrayal creates psychological confusion. It forces the empath to reevaluate not just one moment, but the entire foundation of the relationship itself. This is why betrayal can feel traumatic. The human brain naturally seeks consistency and emotional safety in relationships. But deception destroys consistency. It creates emotional contradiction. One reality existed emotionally, while another reality existed secretly underneath it. And when those two realities collide, the nervous system experiences shock. That is why many empaths become hypervigilant after betrayal. They overanalyze behavior. They struggle to relax emotionally. They begin questioning intentions constantly because their sense of safety was deeply violated. People often criticize empaths for feeling things too deeply, but depth is not weakness. The pain exists because they genuinely valued honesty. They treated connection as something meaningful enough to deserve integrity. In a world where many relationships become superficial and transactional, empaths often still believe emotional truth matters. And that belief makes betrayal especially painful because dishonesty feels like the destruction of something sacred. What hurts even more is that empaths usually ignore warning signs long before the betrayal fully reveals itself. Their intuition often notices inconsistencies early. They feel emotional distance. They sense hidden tension. They recognize subtle behavioral shifts. But because they want harmony, they silence their own instincts. They tell themselves they are overthinking. They choose understanding over confrontation, and many times they continue giving chances long after trust has already started breaking internally. Eventually, however, something changes. The empath stops focusing on excuses and begins focusing on patterns. They realize apologies without behavioral change are meaningless. They realize words alone cannot repair emotional damage. Trust is not rebuilt through emotional speeches. It is rebuilt through consistent honesty repeated over time. And once an empath emotionally disconnects, the shift becomes powerful. Most people expect anger after betrayal, but often the empath becomes quiet instead. The emotional energy that once fought desperately to preserve the relationship slowly disappears, not because they stopped caring instantly, but because exhaustion replaced hope. And silence born from disappointment carries a different kind of finality. It is no longer emotional reaction, it is emotional acceptance. Because eventually the empath understands something life-changing. Real love should not require constant recovery from dishonesty. Real connection should not demand endless emotional survival. And once that truth fully settles inside them, they begin protecting their peace differently. That is when betrayal stops becoming only pain and starts becoming wisdom. There comes a point in every empath's life where exhaustion becomes stronger than hope. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly through repeated disappointment, through conversations that lead nowhere, through promises that sound beautiful but never become action, through emotional labor that is never equally returned. And eventually the empath realizes they are carrying the entire emotional weight of the relationship alone. At first, they try to fix everything. They explain their feelings carefully. They communicate with patience. They search for understanding instead of blame, because empaths naturally believe connection can be healed through honesty. Even after being hurt, they continue giving chances. They study behavior. They analyze emotional wounds. They convince themselves the other person simply needs more understanding, more time, more compassion. And this is why many people misunderstand empaths completely. They mistake patience for weakness. They mistake forgiveness for lack of boundaries. They assume the empath will continue tolerating emotional inconsistency forever because they always have before. But what they fail to understand is that every empath has an emotional limit. And once that limit is reached, something fundamental changes inside them. The over-explaining stops. The long emotional conversations disappear. The repeated attempts to save the relationship slowly fade away. And suddenly the person who once fought hardest for the connection becomes emotionally quiet. This silence confuses many people because they mistake silence for sadness or emotional collapse. But often the empath's silence represents clarity. It is the moment they finally stop fighting reality. The moment they recognize they cannot force honesty, effort, accountability, or emotional maturity from someone unwilling to give it freely. That realization changes everything. Because before this stage, the empath still believed communication could solve the problem. They believed if they explained their pain clearly enough, the other person would finally understand. But maturity teaches them a painful truth. Some people understand perfectly. They simply choose themselves repeatedly over the relationship. And once the empath sees that pattern clearly, emotional energy begins withdrawing naturally. This is why silence becomes powerful. Not because it is manipulation, not because it is revenge, but because silence removes emotional participation from unhealthy cycles. The empath no longer feels the need to defend their reality constantly. They stop trying to convince someone to care correctly. They stop reopening wounds searching for validation from the same source that created the pain. And psychologically, this shift is massive. Many toxic dynamics survive through emotional engagement. Arguments feed them. Reactions feed them. Constant explanations feed them. But when the empath emotionally detaches, the cycle loses energy. There is nothing left to manipulate because the empath is no longer trying to force connection where truth no longer exists. People often expect empaths to explode before leaving emotionally, but many empaths become calm instead. Their nervous system simply grows tired of surviving the same emotional injury repeatedly, and eventually peace becomes more important than attachment. That is when boundaries begin forming naturally. The empath stops chasing closure because they realize the pattern itself already provided the answer. Repeated disrespect is closure. Repeated dishonesty is closure. Repeated emotional inconsistency is closure. At some point, the behavior becomes impossible to misunderstand. And once an empath fully accepts reality, they become incredibly difficult to manipulate. Because now they are no longer attached to potential, they are attached to truth. The silence that follows is not coldness, it is self-protection. It is emotional wisdom finally replacing emotional survival. And while many people mistake that silence for indifference, the truth is far deeper than that. The empath became silent because they finally learned the painful difference between loving someone and losing themselves trying to save them. The greatest misunderstanding people have about empaths is believing they will never leave. Because empaths are patient, they forgive deeply. They try again after disappointment. They continue searching for understanding even when they are hurting inside. And because of this, many people begin assuming the empath's love is permanent, no matter how badly they are treated. But that assumption becomes the beginning of the end. An empath does not walk away quickly. In fact, they usually stay far longer than they should. They try to repair things privately before giving up publicly. They carry emotional pain silently, while still showing kindness outwardly. They convince themselves the relationship can still be saved if honesty, effort, and emotional accountability finally appear. And for a long time, they continue choosing hope over reality. But repeated disappointment changes even the softest heart. Every lie creates distance. Every broken promise weakens emotional safety. Every act of inconsistency slowly damages trust. And the dangerous thing about emotional erosion is that it happens quietly. The relationship may still look normal on the outside, while internally the empath is already beginning to detach. This is why many people become shocked when the empath finally leaves. They only notice the ending once physical distance appears. But emotionally, the departure started long before that moment. It started during the nights the empath cried silently while still trying to understand someone who refused to understand them. It started during the conversations where their feelings were dismissed, minimized, or ignored. It started every time honesty was requested but deception continued instead. And eventually exhaustion replaces emotional attachment. The empath begins realizing something painful but necessary. Love alone cannot sustain a relationship without integrity. No amount of compassion can repair repeated dishonesty. No amount of patience can force emotional maturity into someone unwilling to grow. That realization becomes transformational. Because once the empath stops focusing on potential and starts focusing on patterns, the illusion collapses completely. They no longer judge the relationship by beautiful words or temporary moments of affection. They judge it by consistency, by emotional safety, by truth repeated over time. And if those things no longer exist, something inside them quietly closes. Most people think an empath leaves because they stopped loving, but often the opposite is true. The empath leaves because they loved too deeply to continue living inside emotional instability. They leave because staying began destroying their peace, self-respect, and emotional health. And this is what many manipulative or emotionally immature people fail to understand. The empath's kindness was never weakness, it was grace. And grace has limits when truth is continuously violated. Once those limits are crossed enough times, the empath changes permanently. The over-explaining disappears. The emotional chasing disappears. The desperate attempts to repair everything disappear. Instead, calmness appears. Distance appears. Acceptance appears. And strangely, that quiet acceptance becomes far more powerful than anger ever was. Because anger still carries emotional attachment. But emotional detachment means the empath has finally accepted reality. At that stage, apologies often arrive too late. Not because the empath became cruel, but because trust has already collapsed under the weight of repeated contradictions. The nervous system no longer feels safe enough to reopen fully. And when safety disappears long enough, the heart naturally begins protecting itself. Walking away then becomes an act of survival instead of punishment. The empath is no longer leaving to teach someone a lesson. They are leaving because they finally learned their own lesson. That love should not require constant suffering. That loyalty should not demand self-abandonment. That peace matters too. And once an empath fully understands that truth, their departure becomes one of the most final decisions they will ever make. Because the person who once fought hardest to stay eventually becomes the person who never returns. One of the hardest lessons an empath learns is that words alone mean very little without consistent behavior behind them. People can speak beautifully. They can promise loyalty, honesty, growth, and love. They can say exactly what another person wants to hear, but eventually truth reveals itself through patterns, not performances. And this is why emotionally aware people pay close attention to consistency, because consistency exposes character. At the beginning of most relationships, people show their best side. Effort is high, attention is high, emotional energy feels genuine and exciting. But over time, performance becomes difficult to maintain if authenticity does not exist underneath it. The mask slowly weakens, contradictions begin appearing, promises stop matching actions, words lose alignment with behavior. And this is the moment where an empath begins noticing things others often ignore. Not because they are searching for flaws, but because emotional inconsistency creates tension. A person says they care deeply, yet repeatedly creates emotional instability. They apologize sincerely, yet continue repeating the same harmful patterns. They ask for trust while constantly hiding information or avoiding accountability. Eventually, the empath realizes something painful. The issue is no longer misunderstanding. The issue is repeated behavior revealing true priorities. And patterns never lie for very long. This is what manipulative people fail to understand. Deception can survive temporarily through charm, excuses, emotional intensity, or distraction. But over time, repeated actions always reveal deeper truth. Human behavior naturally exposes internal character because maintaining false identity becomes exhausting. Reality eventually leaks through every performance. That is why emotionally intelligent people stop focusing only on isolation isolated moments. They begin observing repetition. Because anyone can act loving occasionally, anyone can appear caring temporarily, but real character is revealed through consistency over time, especially during discomfort, conflict, pressure, and accountability. This realization changes the empath completely. At first, many empaths become trapped by potential. They focus on who someone could become instead of who that person repeatedly shows themselves to be. They ignore red flags because they believe healing is possible. They confuse emotional chemistry with emotional safety, and because they naturally see the good in others, they often remain loyal long after reality has already exposed dangerous patterns. But maturity creates discernment. Eventually, the empath stops asking, "What did they mean?" and begins asking, "What are they consistently demonstrating?" That question becomes life-changing because it removes emotional fantasy and replaces it with observable truth. And observable truth creates clarity. Manipulative people often depend on confusion to maintain control. They rely on mixed signals, emotional inconsistency, excuses, guilt, and temporary affection to keep someone emotionally attached. But once the empath fully understands patterns, confusion disappears. They no longer become hypnotized by promises or emotional speeches. They begin trusting behavior over words. That shift makes manipulation much harder. Because emotionally mature people understand that repeated behavior is communication. If someone repeatedly lies, dishonors boundaries, avoids accountability, or creates emotional instability, those actions reveal truth more clearly than apologies ever will. This does not make the empath cold. It makes them aware. They finally understand that compassion without discernment becomes self-destruction. Loving someone should never require abandoning reality. And protecting peace sometimes means accepting painful truth instead of continuing to negotiate with denial. Eventually, the empath realizes closure was never hidden inside one final conversation. Closure was already visible inside the repeated pattern itself. The inconsistency was the answer. The avoidance was the answer. The repeated betrayal was the answer. And once an empath truly sees someone clearly, the illusion cannot survive anymore. Because truth, no matter how delayed, always reveals character in the end. The final stage of an empath's journey is not becoming cold, detached, or emotionless. It is becoming clear. Clear about people, clear about energy, clear about truth. After years of overgiving, over-explaining, forgiving too much, and carrying emotional weight that was never theirs to carry, the empath finally reaches a point where self-respect becomes stronger than emotional attachment. And that moment changes everything. For most of their life, the empath believed love meant endurance, staying patient during pain, remaining understanding during disrespect, continuing to fight for connection even when the relationship slowly destroyed their peace. They believed if they loved deeply enough, healed enough, sacrificed enough, things would eventually improve. But reality teaches a painful lesson many empaths spend years trying to avoid. Love alone cannot save relationships that continuously violate honesty. No amount of compassion can force emotional maturity into someone who refuses accountability. No amount of loyalty can create stability inside a connection built on inconsistency. And eventually, the empath grows tired of surviving relationships that constantly require emotional recovery. This is where awakening begins. Not in anger, not in revenge, but in truth. The empath starts recognizing that emotional suffering was never proof of love. Constant anxiety was never intimacy. Walking on emotional eggshells was never safety. And slowly they stop romanticizing pain disguised as connection. That realization becomes freedom, because now the empath begins changing the questions they ask themselves. Instead of asking, "How do I keep this person from leaving?" they ask, "Why am I abandoning myself to keep this relationship alive?" Instead of asking, "How do I make them understand my worth?" they ask, "Why am I trying to prove my value to someone committed to misunderstanding it?" And once these questions appear, emotional transformation begins. The empath no longer measures relationships by intensity alone. They begin valuing peace, consistency, honesty, and emotional safety more than temporary passion or emotional chaos. They stop confusing emotional highs and lows with genuine love. They stop chasing people who only appreciate them when convenient. And for the first time, they begin protecting their own nervous system instead of constantly rescuing everyone else's. This is where boundaries become powerful. Before awakening, boundaries often felt like guilt. The empath worried about disappointing others. They feared rejection, conflict, or abandonment. But maturity teaches them something life-changing. Boundaries are not punishment. Boundaries are self-respect in action. They are the decision to stop allowing repeated harm into spaces meant for peace. And suddenly the empath becomes harder to manipulate, not because they stopped caring, but because they stopped negotiating with behavior that repeatedly dishonors truth. They no longer ignore red flags hoping potential will eventually become reality. They trust patterns instead of promises. They trust consistency instead of emotional speeches. They trust actions instead of temporary words spoken during moments of desperation. That awareness creates emotional strength unlike anything they had before. Now silence feels peaceful instead of lonely. Walking away feels empowering instead of heartbreaking. Solitude feels safer than emotional confusion. And most importantly, the empath no longer fears losing people who continuously damage their spirit. They fear losing themselves by staying too long where honesty no longer exists. This becomes the final awakening. The empath finally understands they were never meant to save everyone. They were never meant to carry every broken soul at the cost of their own emotional health. Compassion should never require self-destruction. And once this truth fully settles into their heart, they stop loving blindly. They start loving wisely. Because the awakened empath finally realizes something powerful. Peace is not something you beg from others. Peace is something you protect within yourself.